Ladies and gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to St. Ebbe's Church. My name is Vaughan Roberts. I'm the rector of the church, and this is John Lennox, and we'll introduce John, or at least, John, you're going to introduce yourself in just a moment. First of all, you can see up there a QR code. That will get you onto Slido, so do at any point during the course of this evening, put in questions. It may be that I can weave them in because this is going to be a discussion, but I will be asking questions, very much the non-expert to draw John out, and I might be able to weave some of your questions in. Otherwise, after we've covered quite a bit of the ground, we'll deal with some of these questions. Our topic today is artificial intelligence, and the title is the title of a book that John himself has written. It's called 2084, Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Humanity. It's obviously a huge, huge issue. And John, maybe I could just start by asking you, how did you get into this? Because this isn't your particular discipline, is it? So what's your kind of day job? What do you normally focus on? And how did you get into AI stuff?
Well, thank you. And let me say thank you so very much for coming this evening. It's such a pleasure to be back in this church with Vaughan, who's been a friend for a long time. I've always been interested in the interface between science, philosophy, and theology in connection with the big questions. I've been a mathematician all my life until, well, a while ago when I became an emeritus professor in this university. But questions of the way in which science impacts our culture and our concept of who we are as human beings has been a very important theme in my life. It goes back actually to my parents in Northern Ireland. I come sadly from a country that's known sectarian violence. And you'll understand a little bit where I'm coming from if I tell you that my father had a medium-sized store in a small town, and he employed about 40 people at maximum, I suppose. But he ran the risk of employing people from two sides of a sectarian divide. And he got bombed for it. And I once asked him why he took that risk. And he said, look, he said, I really believe the idea that all men and women, irrespective of their worldview, are precious because they're made in the image of God, and I want to treat them like that. And that has been a leitmotif for me in my life, the value of human beings. And of course, as technology has moved on, the whole question of what is a human being is coming more and more to the fore as machines appear to be narrowing the distance. In 1948, Norbert Wiener, who's a pioneer in computer theoretical computing, said he thought that possibly chess was the thing that distinguished the human mind from a machine. Well, we all can have a chess-playing program on our iPhones quite easily. So that's one of the reasons, but the specific reason I got into this was some years ago, I was invited to address a conference on artificial intelligence and human beings. And I was asked to speak on the biblical concept of the human being, to speak into this discussion. And I first of all said, no, you want someone who's right in this stuff. And then I thought, look, you're actually interested in technology, not from the hands-on building neural networks or deep learning machines, but you're interested in the philosophy of technology and its impact in society. So as I started to work on this, I realized, first of all, the great deal has been thought about it, written about, but secondly, it was enormously important. And I spent several years working pretty hard on it, and the result was 2084. And you all have heard of George Orwell's book, and it's a great title, and I say that because it wasn't my idea. I was on my way to debate a rather well-known professor at this university, Peter Atkins, in the University of Southampton, and we were on the opposite sides of the question. And he asked me what I was writing. So I told him, he said, "I've got a title for you." And he gave me the title. So I said, "Peter, done." So he's acknowledged in the book. He thought of it.
I think you've given us a trailer for a number of themes that we need to come back to. How AI factors in on who we are as human beings, future, God, all of these things. But let's just start with some basics. Can we begin with some definitions? There'll be a variety of people. Some will know a lot about this stuff. Others might be at a very low level. So just AI, what is AI?
Well, AI is a number of things. There are many AIs. And there are two basic kinds, as I understand it. There's narrow AI and general AI. Now, narrow AI is the stuff that works at the moment and does marvelous things with your smartphone. A narrow AI predictor system picks up on what you buy on Amazon, and it then issues little messages that people who bought that particular thing also had a look at this particular thing. So, to sum up, a narrow AI system does one thing usually, and only one thing, that normally requires human intelligence for its performance. The system is not itself intelligent, hence the word artificial, but its output makes it look as if it were intelligent. And I'll give you one more example, which is being very much used at the moment in medical diagnostics. So here's an AI system. You'll have a large database. So let's assume the database is 500,000 photographs of lungs infected by, let's say, coronavirus. And then your X-ray is fed into that. And the program, the algorithm in the machine will compare the photo of your lungs with those 500,000 very rapidly, and it will feed out a diagnosis. And in many instances now, the diagnosis you get from that will be better than your average doctor in your local hospital, for the simple reason that the database doesn't only consist of photographs, it consists of labeled photographs, labeled with the diseases they represent, put there by the best doctors, let's say, around the world. And that's being rolled out all the time with enormous success. Then there's the second kind, artificial general intelligence, and that's an aspiration, and it is, of course, a playground of science fiction. And the idea there is to develop a system that can do everything that human intelligence can nowadays do, but do it faster and do it better and be superior to human intelligence. And research there goes in two directions, research plus speculation. The two directions are, firstly, to take existing humans and enhance them, possibly merging them with machines, and hence you get all the films about humanity becoming cyborg-like and merging with technology. The other way of doing it is to start from scratch. And many people think that biology is a big problem because we decay and we die. So why not create something from scratch based possibly on something like silicon, onto which we can upload the contents of our minds, whatever that might mean and involve. And so you move towards a superintelligence that way. And we're at the stage where that's always reckoned to be about 50 years from now. It keeps shifting, I notice. But the reason I'm interested in that, and don't dismiss it as entirely fictional, is because some of the finest scientific minds in the world are convinced that we're going to get there. One of them is our astronomer royal, Lord Rees, who says that technology is going to change what it means to be a human being, that some 100 years hence, they will scarcely have a memory of what we were like. Now, when you get leading scientists and thinkers moving in that direction, then I feel I need to take this seriously, because many people are. And of course, it's the stuff not only of fiction, but of books like the best-selling books of Yuval Noah Harari and his book, Homo Deus, with which I've interacted quite a great deal in my book. So two kinds of AI, various AIs that do all kinds of different things. There are masses of them. Think of the Industrial Revolution that gave us machines. There are millions of different kinds of machines. So you can compare that to the current situation where we're getting millions of different kinds of AIs doing different things.
Again, I think we've got an agenda that will keep us going forever. Just those...
It will.
That brief comment there raises all sorts of questions. Let's start with the narrow AI and what's happening already and what is about to happen. You told me that since writing this book, how long has this book been out?
I think 2 years.
And you feel you kind of need a rewrite already because things have moved on so quickly. So what's just down the road from here, and how's it going to change us?
Well, there have been utterly fascinating and unprecedented developments in narrow AI alone. Because what has happened, there's been a transition from the early AIs, say chess-playing AIs, that relied on being fed with a vast array of famous chess games. That was the input, that was the data. And then they learned something on top of that, their program. But there was a quantum leap 2 or 3 years ago where there was a program developed called Alpha Zero. The zero meaning that there was no information given beyond the basic rules of the game, so it taught itself to play. And the famous example is it took on the world champion in the game of Go, which is a very famous game in China and the Far East particularly, but played all over the world. And I gather 100 million people watched these games. They were so interesting, and the machine, I believe, won 4-1, and this was totally unprecedented. 2 years after that, and we're coming up just a couple of years ago, one problem in science that was thought to be beyond human reach, and that is the fact that proteins fold. This is a fascinating thing, that proteins in our bodies, in their cells, contain information at various levels. One of them's in the DNA, but another is in their folding in three-dimensional geometrical shapes. And the big challenge was, can you predict how proteins will fold? Because their folding depends on how they interact with other molecules. And that's crucially important when you're developing vaccines and antibiotics and all this kind of thing. Well, the same developers, DeepMind, developed a program called AlphaFold, and they solved this problem. And what would have taken months, years, and perhaps even been impossible, they're now, I believe, what was it, by last Christmas, they'd 120,000 proteins, they'd worked out how they folded. And that has meant that they've been able to develop certain antibiotics. I'm not sure whether they're on the market, but there's a famous one called halicin. And the HAL comes from HAL, the robot in 2001, A Space Odyssey. And this can deal with virtually every known bacterially resistant disease up to now. So these are unprecedented and wonderful results. Now, I think it's important, and we can come to this when it's appropriate, but there are negative sides to AI, but it's good to emphasize that this is great stuff, and I very much encourage people to get involved for several reasons, to which we'll come.
Well, I was going to ask you that question because some, you talk about proteins, some are nodding away and thinking, yes, I understand that, it's amazing. And others switched off pretty early on and thought, well, this is great, this is for the scientists amongst us. And I guess there'd be some who are thinking, you know, all of this stuff, can't we just leave it to the experts? Why should all of us be interested in this topic?
Well, we should all be interested because we're all being watched. This country has more CCTV cameras than North America. I don't know whether you were aware of that. And they calculate that we're on television roughly as we move about every 5 minutes. Now, facial recognition has been one of the success stories of AI systems. There are now cameras that not only can recognize your face in a crowd, they can recognize you from your gait and from the rear. And if you're wearing a face mask, for example. Now, you can see that that is very advantageous to a police force that wants to recognize potential terrorists in a football crowd or a rugby crowd. But it's only a step from facial recognition used by, let's say, a benevolent government to facial recognition technologies used by a totalitarian government to suppress an ethnic minority. And that, as you well know, is happening in parts of the world today and repressing people, for example, the Uyghurs, in a Muslim group in China. And the lengths to which the technology has been developed to do this has, of course, created a furore around the world. And a year or so ago, there was an article in Time magazine about this, written by a Chinese observer. And she said, you know, the only difference between the West and the East on this is that the technology is all here, but it's not yet, and there was emphasis on the yet, under a central totalitarian government. So this is a huge problem from the point of view of surveillance. But let's put it this way. I crudely put it, and it's slightly unfair. Let's say surveillance totalitarianism. This was the sort that George Orwell foresaw in 1984, which is still worth reading. But then there's surveillance capitalism. What many of us do not realize is that our smartphones, well, they're trackers. And here we are, practically all of us, I suspect, in this room, wearing a tracker system voluntarily. It's amazing, isn't it? And how much it's actually tracking, none of us really know. Sound, is it or isn't it? Can you switch it off? All this kind of stuff. And in the commercial world, there's a fascinating book by an MIT professor called Shoshana Zuboff that is being taken very seriously around the world. It's a massive book. It's called Surveillance Capitalism. And in that book, she says that leading global corporations are harvesting data about you and about me, and they're selling it on without our permission to third parties, international global players. And this is not some small thing in the commercial world. It's now they're talking in terms of millions, if not billions of dollars. Are we aware of it? Well, some of us feel that many of us may be sleepwalking into a situation that moves incrementally towards control. And of course, it raises deep questions. How much privacy do you sacrifice in order to have security? That is the fundamental tension. So I give you that example to indicate that AI, even narrow AI, that has a positive use, can also raise vast ethical problems. And I often say to people, you know, artificial intelligence is like any tool, like a knife. You can use a sharp knife for surgery to heal someone, or you can use it for murder.
You raised the question of control and power. And of course, as these systems get more and more powerful and they can do more, those who control them will have more and more power. There's a question that's come through. How should we respond to increasingly powerful governments with AI? But you might broaden that. Is this out of control? Is there regulation? What more could or should be done?
Well, there are 3 or 4 questions there. It was Vladimir Putin said that the nation that succeeds in leading the world at AI will control the world. That's a rather chilling statement. Now, leading players have become increasingly aware that the technology has, not surprisingly, outpaced the ethical underpinning. But simultaneously, they've become aware that we need to think hard about the ethics. Because many of the scenarios people develop about these things, and I say a lot of it is fictionalism, fiction and it's hype, they sense that, well, to quote Elon Musk, of whom you may have heard, AI is, he said, summoning the demon, and we need to control it. And there have been major conferences around the world to set up ethical principles. One famous set of principles was developed by Isaac Asimov a long time ago, but the Asilomar principles at a conference in America were set up. And of course, they're the things you would expect. Let's develop AI that's benevolent towards humans. Because, of course, many people, increasing number, fear that because many aspects of these technologies, especially nowadays, the people who designed them don't even know what they're doing or how they're doing it. And will they get out of control? And it's an interesting parody, actually, of the biblical situation. God created humans, and they got out of control. And one eminent computer scientist has said, Genesis has got it exactly right. Humans now need to fear their own creations getting out of control. And as far as I can see, the only saving feature is something that's common to the vast majority of humanity. And I believe it's because we're made morally in the image of God. There's a set of values that is essentially common, as C.S. Lewis pointed out long ago. There are many variations in cultures, but there are basic common values that we can work on. But the problem is, as every business executive knows, it's one thing to have a moral mission statement on the wall of your boardroom. It's another thing to get it into the hearts of your executives. And the dominant ethical principle in the Western world, at least today, is utilitarianism, or preference utilitarianism, as Peter Singer would put it.
And just define that for us,
yes,
if you would.
Well, utilitarianism basically means the idea that you seek the maximum benefit from the maximum number of people. Let's imagine you've got ice cream and you're dividing it among children. The maximum benefit for the maximum number of children is to give them exactly the same each, or you're in trouble. And you can understand this. It works very well if there are equal centers of power. And if you watch Hitler, in his political infancy, he made treaties. I'll do this if you do that. But once he got the power, he tore the treaties up, because if people said, if you do that, you'll what? You'll what? And of course, that's what we face. In global centers of power that are unequal, that goes because you need something else to say why you should do it. You see, utilitarianism has a built-in obvious flaw, as any ethicist will tell you. What if the maximum benefit for the maximum number of people is to murder 8 million Jews and 6 million Poles? You see what I mean?
You've got a big issue with power, but have you not also got an issue with how do you define benefit? Or what is for the good? And what is the good human life?
Well, absolutely you have. And I notice flourishing in universities around, and in fact, in relatively recent visits to America, I've noticed that students often ask, will you talk to us about what is the good life? People are still searching for what Plato talked about centuries ago. What is the good life? And that raises deep questions, because you very rapidly get to the point where you realize that you've got to have some kind of anchor that's outside of yourself. I mean, if I suddenly hit Vaughan, and I'm not intending to do it, by the way, if I suddenly hit him, he might react by saying, that's not fair, and he'd expect me to accept that, because he will react as most people will react, as if there's a standard outside both of us, which you must accept. And that seems to me to be a pointer to the fact that there are transcendent values. And I believe that it is very important. Some folk think that you can avoid the question of morality and eventually the God question in this whole sphere. You can't, ladies and gentlemen. You cannot. And for centuries, particularly in Europe, but elsewhere, there has been an underpinning of what is felt to be right and good that's come from the Judeo-Christian tradition. And we're about, the second generation to have essentially rejected that. There's no mention of God in the European Constitution. But even atheist thinkers, like Jürgen Habermas, who's one of the brightest people on the planet, says, and he's an atheist, but he said we need to be very careful before we get rid of the Judeo-Christian tradition, because so far it's where all our fundamental values come from that define our civilization. And I believe this whole thing, looked at in a broader way, is a wake-up call to begin to re-examine things that many people have rejected.
Just moving on a little bit further, there's a question here. In terms of our use of technology like AI, might it be that the most precise dystopian parallel from literature isn't 1984, but Brave New World? And I guess that's picking up on something we began to touch on. If the purpose of narrow AI is to make life easier and better, well, how do you define better? And Brave New World here is a culture, as I understand it, as I remember it, anyway, where suffering's removed, essentially. But what's the value of that?
By a drug called Soma. Well, that's a very perceptive question, actually. Thank you for that. Because you have these two very famous books, 1984 and Brave New World, and they're very different. Because the scenario in 1984 is that we will be oppressed by the technology and it will ruin us. In Brave New World, we fall in love with our technology and it ruins us. Now, in the current state of things, it seems to me, although it seems very paradoxical, both things are happening simultaneously. We love our technology, but we can see that some of it can become very rapidly extremely oppressive. So I think the questioner is correct. We need to be thinking about both strands, not one or the other. And it pushes back again, what do we mean by well-being? Well, the Greeks, I love the Greeks. I'd love to have known Socrates, and he continues to inspire me. But they were fascinated by what things are made of. And of course, modern technology is all concerned with material science, what things are made of. But they always asked a deeper question. What are things made for? And I often ask people in a seminar, what do you think you were made for? And that can create quite a deal of heart searching and looking at the floor and scratching ears and so on. Is there anything we were made for? Is there a teleology in the universe? Is there purpose? And of course, the natural sciences cannot answer that question. But it doesn't mean it's an irrational question. And it was the late Sir Peter Medawar, a Nobel Prize winner, who said, look, science has its limits. That's very easy to see. It cannot answer the question that a child would ask, where do I come from, where am I going, what's the meaning of my life? And he very wisely said, you go to other, not irrational disciplines, but rational disciplines of history and experience and psychology and literature and so on, and theology to find out the answers to those questions. And I think once again, once you start to ask those questions, you find that you're verging on big theological as well as philosophical questions. You can't get God out of the equation.
You've raised the issue of well-being and the issue of humanity. Who are we as human beings? So one can imagine a future in which many of the normal tasks of life that we do are done by machines.
Yes.
And in one sense, that sounds like paradise. And yet it's dehumanizing. But can we even talk about dehumanizing? Because that assumes a proper reality as to what it means to be human.
Oh, it does. It does indeed. And this is a very serious question that affects many people, maybe some of you. who've lost your job through the pandemic or through automation and robotic introduction into your companies and so on. And people who think about these things think about the projection of that into the future. And some people are worried about the creation of a large class of people not only without jobs, but are not employable, which is a very serious business indeed. Now, why is it a serious business? And I have to answer this question by looking at it through the lens of my worldview. We all do that. We can't step outside our worldview, and there are basically three families of worldviews, roughly speaking. There's atheism, that says this universe is all that there is no God, and so we look at it through that lens. Then opposite to that, there's theism, which is my position. I am a Christian, so I look at it through that worldview. And then there's another one, pantheism, which tends to believe that the universe and God are one and are an impersonal entity. So looking at it through the lens that I look at it, it seems to me that this problem is serious and acute for the simple reason that work is part of what God created us to do. The Genesis story, the more I read it, seems to be more and more profound. And I can remember my own son years ago coming home weeping because he couldn't get a job. Dad, they don't want me. And people feel that acutely. And I've talked to many people who felt like that, not just young people, but people who've suddenly found that they've been told to clear their desk, and that's it. They don't want me, because it's part of the way in which we are created. In other words, it's coming back to what my father taught me years ago, that human beings, all of us, are special in that we bear the image of God. Now, of course, that's a huge concept, and it includes many things: personality, rationality, and all this kind of thing.
Let me stop you there, because I want
Yes,
to come
please.
back to that. But you've been speaking as a scientist, as a mathematician, and now you've suddenly become a theologian. So what's going on there? Are you switching your brain off? Are you using different brains? Science and faith? How do you square that circle?
Well, it's not a circle that needs to be squared. It's an integrated view, because it seems to me we can explore the world by the methods developed for the natural sciences. That is a grid or a matrix of questions that we address to what we call the natural world, and it's limited. As I said, it can't deal with meaning, it can't deal with ethical questions, and so on. And the great scientists have recognized this. Einstein once said that you can speak about the ethical foundations of science, but you cannot speak of the scientific foundations of ethics. So, in my view, I go back, when I'm asked this question, my first response is to go back to the history of modern science in the 16th and 17th centuries. That the founding fathers, let's start with Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Clerk Maxwell, Babbage, who was the father of computing, by the way, were all Christian believers. Now, why was that? Was that an accident? Well, apparently not. Because the great Sir Alfred North Whitehead and others formulated a thesis which C.S. Lewis encapsulated beautifully by saying men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. You see, faith in God did not hinder the rise of modern science. It was the motor that drove it. Now, you mentioned the word faith, Vaughan. You see, and the impression given to many people, because there are certain vocal philosophers and scientists that think that faith is a religious word and it means believing where there's no evidence. Well, that's false. Faith is an ordinary word. It comes from the Latin fides, fidelity, trust. And we all know it's rather crazy to trust anything, a fact or a person, if there's no evidence on which to base that trust. And therefore, all of us, I would want to argue, are people of faith. We trust all kinds of things. You believed, I gather, that there was a session at 7:30 tonight, and hence you're here. So you're all believers. And it's important to realize that, ladies and gentlemen. We are all people of faith. The question to ask is, faith in what? In many different things. And I have faith in science. I have faith in the rational intelligibility of the universe. And part of the underpinning of that is this is a rational universe because it was created by a rational creator. So I have no sense of tension between the two things. In fact, here's something provocative that I risk saying. The problem is not science and God going together. The problem is science and atheism going together. Because I think atheism dangerously undermines the scientific endeavor. But that's another story for another night.
That could take a long time, so we'll drop that for a moment. Let's go back to being human, what it means to be human. And you mentioned earlier the possibility of expanding our understanding of what it means to be human and somehow merging the human and the machine, cyborgs and so on. These things are not far away in terms of possibilities. Now, what's different about that? I mean, I'm wearing glasses here. You're wearing glasses. So we're kind of used to expanding our capacities. So what are the ethical issues there? What are the philosophical issues? And where do you stand on them?
Well, this is a complex question because we're all grateful for technology. I imagine that, well, I'm wearing technology now. Some of you may have an implant in your ear that's helping you to hear what we're saying. And we can imagine that in days to come, these things will get smaller and smaller, and they become more and more integrated. And there is a lot of research going on, particularly for people who have been disabled in some way or other, using thought control to move their limbs and all this kind of thing. These, I think, can be roughly talked about in the following kind of categories. There's the repair kind of technology, prosthetic limbs, all this kind of thing. The stent in my heart, repair technology. But then there's enhancement technology, that you're not changing the fundamental constitution of the human being, but you are enhancing. I can remember listening to a lecture here in Oxford where the lecturer rather hopefully said, would you like to have the hearing of an owl or the eyes of an eagle? Well, that would be rather nice. I suppose I love owls and eagles equally. But that's one thing, and we are incrementally moving towards that. Where I begin to feel a line must be drawn is where we start meddling with the fundamental descriptors of human beings. In other words, meddle with the genetic code and alter it. C.S. Lewis wrote a book around 1940 called The Abolition of Man, and it was prescient. He also wrote a brilliant science fiction book called That Hideous Strength, which gets the same ideas across. But he talked about a group of scientists, brilliant scientists, experimenting with human beings. And I fear a lot of this has been done and is being done to alter them so that all down through successive generations, they will be specified by the particular group of scientists, but according to what criteria? And Lewis makes the chilling point. He says they won't be human at all. They will be artifacts. And that is a chilling idea. And it does concern me because there is quite a body of opinion that says if it can be done, it should be done. We should experiment. Now, years ago, Nazi Germany experimented with eugenics, and eugenics experiments were not unknown in other countries either. The Soviets planned to create a new man. Read Trotsky on that, for example. So that has been in the air, but now we've got the technology to do these kind of things where we never had it before. So germline engineering would seem to me to be a major no. Now, of course, if you've got no transcendent ethical principles, you'll say, well, why shouldn't we? It's just, say, the human embryo. It's just a blob of cells. It's just material. Why shouldn't we do with it what we want and see what we can make of it? And if we don't like that, we're going to have to argue against it. But we're going to have a basis to argue against it. It's no use saying, I don't like you doing that, because if they've got the power and the ability, they'll do it whether you like it or not. We've got to have something bigger than ourselves to look up to. And the tragedy, to my mind, is that people will reject something like the Christian faith that gives this without even having listened to what it has to say.
You mentioned earlier Yuval Noah Harari's book, Homo Deus. Strikes me as a very interesting title, given what you've just been talking about there. He is quite optimistic about the future, but with sort of hints of pessimism going on as well. Do you want to say anything about that? Because a number will have read that book, I imagine.
It's a fascinating book, and I find it a little difficult because of those seemingly contrary strands of thinking there. But what I make of it is, Homo Deus, of course, means in Latin, the God-man. It's a very, very old idea. And its genesis is in Genesis, in the famous story of the temptation in the Garden of Eden, where God's enemies suggested to the human beings that they should take of the forbidden fruit and disobey God, and they would be like gods, knowing good and evil. And the huge mistake of many philosophers who ought to know better think that God was forbidding them knowledge. He wasn't. It was the knowledge of good and evil, which when they got it was something that you wouldn't want to have at all. But that's another story. And the problem is, throughout history, there has been this searching for godhood. It was very evident in the times of the Egyptian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Assyrian Empire, and the Roman Empire, and even in my younger day, people like Ceausescu, who was worshipped essentially as a god, and hymns sung to him, all this kind of thing. There's something within powerful human beings that wants to reach for godhood. And Harari has got this agenda for the 21st century. He's very straight about it. And he says that there are two big agenda items for this century. Number one, the abolition of physical death as a technical problem. Death is simply a technical problem now, he thinks, and technical problems have technical solutions. And what he means by that is, you won't have to die. People will die, but they won't have to die. And the second thing is, using all kinds of cyborg technologies, artificial intelligence, etc., we will enhance human pleasure. So those are the two big drives, the search for godhood and the enhancement of human pleasure. And he says that this is going to be the agenda for this century.
It's a good agenda to have. I mean, death is a massive problem.
Yes.
We want to want the best possible life. So as a Christian, what do you make of that? And what do you make of the future? Are you an optimist? Are you a pessimist?
Well, I'm both, really. Let me put it this way. When I meet people, and I do, who hold Harari's view, and they tell me this is a marvelous thing, trying to abolish death and enhance human happiness, I say to them, you're too late. And they look at me with considerable puzzlement. And they said, what do you mean you're too late? Well, I said, actually, the problem of physical death has been solved in the resurrection of Jesus Christ 20 centuries ago. And of course, that rocks them back a bit, because if the central message of the Christian faith is true, then there is a solution to the death problem. And I said, coupled with it, the solution to the problem of everlasting life or eternal life, which you're searching for, and life's enhancement has been solved as well. And they say, well, how does that happen? Well, I said, it's worth listening in the context of all this drive with artificial intelligence and so on. It's worth listening to what this message is in the context of these technologies. Because Christ gave this message. He said if people were prepared to trust him as the one whose resurrection from the dead proved he was God incarnate, if they're prepared to face the mess they've made of their own lives and possibly, sadly, the lives of others, and trust him, he will give them a series of things that answer all these questions. Peace with God, forgiveness, a life that will outlive death. And I said, you know, those of you who are hoping for your brains to be upgraded someday, uploaded onto silicon, the greatest uploading will occur if Christianity is true, when Christ returns and raises from the dead all who have trusted him. And that's the hope I have as a scientist and as a Christian. Absolutely. And it gives me great confidence in the future, whatever happens. But I'm not a cockeyed optimist in the sense that I can see developments already on Earth. I don't have to speculate. I see them there, where these technologies could very rapidly be used to oppress a very large proportion, a very much larger proportion of the Earth's surface than they oppress today.
We've got a few minutes left. I'm going to just now pick up on various other things, and then I wanted to draw you out on a little bit more on what you just said. The issue of personality we've touched on, but here's a question that relates to it. Where do you stand on the personhood of a successful general AI? Would an AI be the recipient of God's love? Would it be capable of sin? It's a broader question, though, as well, the question of personhood.
Well, there's a mathematician that appears on television a lot, and she says, worrying about that question is like worrying about life on Mars. So far, we haven't even got to the complexity of a worm. But taking the question seriously,
just before you do that, then, you said it's always 50 years ahead.
Yes, the singularity.
Yes. So, what do you think? Is it seriously a possibility, the singularity? And I think it relates, perhaps, to this question of personhood.
Well, it depends how you define the singularity. Ray Kurzweil, who I think was responsible for the term, the idea is when the machines will reach more than human intelligence, and they may take over or they may not take over. That's the idea of the singularity. And the fear on the part of some is that they will take over. The big problem is where we started. I said artificial intelligence. And there's an elderly pioneer in AI, and I quoted him in America at a lecture. And after I'd finished, this beaming, elderly, tall man came up and he said, I am that man. And he was at a conference of pioneers in this work, and he read a paper. And the title of the paper is brilliant. Here's the title of his paper. The word artificial in artificial intelligence is real. Have you got it? The word artificial in artificial intelligence is real. Now, this is a subject of a whole lengthy discussion. Alan Turing, the genius that solved the Enigma problem of German encryption, invented what was called the imitation game. I think somebody had the idea before. And that is, if a computer, a machine, could convince you that there was a human at the other end, so to speak, talking to you, then it ought to be accepted as intelligent. But of course, people have pointed out, many of them, including John Searle, the philosopher, that simulating intelligence is not the same as being intelligent. And here we come to what seems to me to be a huge barrier or mountain in the way of anything that will remove the word artificial or be really intelligent. You see, in human beings, intelligence is coupled to consciousness. That's what God has done. We, at the moment, scientifically, have no idea what consciousness is, let alone the capacity to begin to build it. And so Stuart Russell, who gave the Reith Lectures this year on artificial intelligence, pointed out very clearly that their objective was not to reproduce consciousness, that simulation was enough, because the whole idea is to create technology that will give us the same output as intelligent human beings will do. And they're not even trying to create consciousness or make it. So until that barrier is achieved, I think there's no need to fear in one sense. But of course, it's quite obvious that the power of the technology is going so fast that one wouldn't want to predict exactly what might happen and what might go wrong, because it has been pointed out that the more complicated a machine is, the more foolish and dangerous it can become when it starts to make mistakes. So think of one of the most powerful artificial intelligences. I think it's called GPT-3, which can write very convincing essays that answer philosophical questions, solve mathematical equations. It was asked, or one version of it was asked, should I kill myself? And the answer came, I think you should. Now, this is a whole subject of serious ethical consideration because, for example, there's a lot of technology that's used now for job interviews, and people are beginning to bitterly complain that they never see a person. It's all done by machine. And the machines act according to the inbuilt worldview of their programmers. And they've found to be biased against women, for example, or biased against people of color, and so on and so forth. How do you ensure? And we need to, a lot more work needs to be done on this particular question. So I'm not sure whether a singularity will ever happen, but I just don't know. And the reason I hesitate, Vaughan, is because there's an indicator in the last book of the Bible that humans may succeed in doing more than we might dream. Because there's some people that say God will never allow X, or he'll never allow Y, or he'll never allow people to create life. But there's a pretty, in a way, scary chapter in the book of Revelation that seems to indicate that in a future time, there will be the invention or creation of something that is very convincing that it has at least some kind of artificial life and has the power to enslave people, control the economy of the world, and to kill whoever it wants. And that fits exactly, as I say in my book, into one of the scenarios that has been developed in his book, Life 3.0, by the brilliant professor of physics at Princeton University. And what I want to argue is, if people are prepared to take those kind of scenarios seriously, I want to say, before you reject Christianity, have a look at its scenario, because I feel there's much more evidence for the truth of that than there is for many of the speculative ideas that are floating about today.
Well, I'll draw you out on that, because it's quite clear from the way you've been talking, if we want to educate ourselves in these areas, it's not about just learning the science and about the technology. This raises huge issues about who am I, what is a human being, ethical issues, what is human well-being, and so on. So suppose someone is saying, well, I want to think about these big issues, and you're a Christian, And I want to think about them from a Christian perspective. Where would you point them to?
Well, I point people to where I got started, and that is beginning to engage with the text of the New Testament. Because I meet so many people these days, particularly these days, who have a vague idea of Christianity, and it's in terms of religious trappings and rituals and rites and all that kind of thing. They've no idea that there's a message, and that there's a message that claims to be from God. Now, that might be true or false, but you can test it. You see, I'm a scientist, ladies and gentlemen, and in science, testability is crucial. I believe Christianity can be tested. And one of the ways in which it's tested is to read with an open mind, say something like the Gospel of John, the fourth biography of Jesus in the New Testament, and to ask your questions to see, does it make rational sense? Does it expand or narrow your worldview and all this kind of thing? And I've been reading this for 70 years now, and it makes more and more and more sense every day that I look at it. Now, of course, if you were kind to me or to Vaughan, we both have written books explaining exactly what this message involves. But you know, one of the big things for me is we think of human well-being and ourselves and our significance. And often science makes us so small. There's the old idea that we're tiny in the universe. We're only tiny on linear scales. On logarithmic scales, you're about halfway between the size of an atom and the size of the observable universe. But if you didn't know that before, I hope it encourages you. But significance of human beings, version 101, why I think they're really special, is this, that God became one. Have you ever thought about that? That's the central statement of Christianity. The Word became flesh, became human. And if Christianity is true, that marks you out as utterly special, not simply because you are a creation of God, a creature of God, but because Christ loves you and he loves me, and he's done something to rescue us from the mess, as I said earlier, of what we've done with our lives. And we're special because God could become one. We are much more complex. This is reality. This isn't artificial. And that tells me that there are levels and levels of depth to humanity, which is why I suspect that Yuval Harari and no one else, no other person, is going to solve the problem of physical death that easily.
John, thank you very much indeed. You mentioned you've written a number of books. I do commend them. You can find them online. And John has a website, so do have a look at John's website for a variety of talks and other things there. And I do commend this book, 2084, Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Humanity. There are copies at the back, available for sale this evening. John, we're very grateful to you, and at the very least, you deserve a big round of applause.
I think our interviewer deserves a big round of applause.
No. Well, finally, thank you very much indeed for coming. It's been lovely to host you here. We're obviously always here on a Sunday, and we'd be delighted to see you any Sunday for one of our services. And do enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you.